Hey everyone, welcome to Disgorged Online. Hope you're enjoying Wednesday afternoon, evening, whatever time it is where you are. Another actually nice day here in Seattle. Sun came out later on. Today we're going to be talking about Riesling from Germany in particular, and specifically from the Mosel Valley. The wine I am drinking is 2014 J.J. Prum Veltliner Sonnenberg Cabernet Riesling, and we'll get into what all this and much more on the label means in a little bit, because I know that one of the many things that challenges people about Riesling and German Riesling in particular is understanding what's going on with the label. So I'm trying to dive into that and make things a little bit clearer at least. But I wanted to start with Riesling as a variety because I think there are sort of two interesting things happening with Riesling right now. The first of, and for those of you who are more connected to the wine industry might be well aware that Riesling has a reputation as sort of an obsession of a lot of sommeliers, wine professionals in general. And I wanted to kind of explain from our perspective why that is. Okay, so part of it is that there is a preference among a lot of wine professionals for varieties that we feel like are, I guess the best way to describe it is transparent. And by that we mean the sense seems to be that the wine is a reflection of exactly where it's grown and to some extent how it's grown and what's done to it. And all grapes to some degree or another are going to show that those influences for sure. But some varieties are a little more opaque in that sense. I think, for example, to talk about a variety that I touched on a few episodes ago, Sauvignon Blanc tends to sort of have a lot of the same characteristics, sort of no matter where it's grown. Riesling, on the other hand, can be wildly different depending on where it's grown, a little bit how it's grown, and again, how it's made. It's not the only variety like that. A lot of the other really sort of highly regarded varieties, Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, others can have that same character, but Riesling is definitely one of them. The other reasons that I think it's become a favorite of sommeliers and wine professionals has to do, and we'll talk about this when we taste, but has to do a little bit with this idea of what I might call precision or focus. And in that, I mean, the wine seems to have a sort of vitality to it. I know these are sort of poetic and ill-defined words, and I apologize. I wish I could be a little more precise in my own wording. But that is a characteristic of really good Riesling, is that it has this sort of focus to it. And again, and I'm apparently going to just be contrasting with Sauvignon Blanc, which in some ways makes sense because Sauvignon Blanc is another sort of high acid, bright, racy variety. Riesling has a lot of that character, but it also has a sort of polish to it, I guess, is a way to think about it, that Sauvignon Blanc doesn't often have. Sauvignon Blanc can be sort of exuberant and all over the place, along with being very kind of energetic. And Riesling has a degree of precision, as I mentioned, that I think a lot of sommeliers and other professionals find appealing. The last two reasons that I would give, one is that it has age-worthy quality to it. The wines change with time. They're capable of aging for a number of years. As you might have noticed, I'm drinking a 2014, which for white wine seems old. For Riesling is still pretty young. I've had Rieslings that are 20, 25, 30 years old that show quite well. They definitely change over time, as any wine would, but can have a really interesting sort of progression as they age and be enjoyable at different stages in that aging process. And then the last thing I would say is that for a lot of people, a lot of professionals, and I would certainly include myself in this category, we see Riesling as a little bit of I wouldn't say a lost cause. That's maybe the wrong way to put it, but there is a little bit of we are trying to highlight what was once considered perhaps the world's finest wine. In the case of these Rieslings from the Mosel, certainly were for a period of time the most expensive wines on the planet, and have a lot to offer to wine drinkers, but they've been, cast aside in a lot of ways, in a lot of cases. And the biggest reason for that is that many of them, although not all of them, have some degree of residual sugar. And we exist in a time and a place now in the wine world and in the world in general where sweetness is largely looked down upon. It's seen as a sign of cheapness, and a lot of that has to do with, frankly, a lot of very inexpensive, sweet German wine, mostly Riesling based, but some other whites as well, that was that was sort of pumped onto the market, especially in the 60s and 70s. Stuff like Blue Nun, which is the most famous brand. And the other reason is that even more broadly, sweetness has become so widely accessible to us in our everyday lives. There's sugar in everything, pretty much, it seems like, and many people are trying to sort of cut sugar out of their lives as much as they can. And as a result, the sort of naturally achieved sweetness of these wines is no longer prized. It's no longer seen as a sign of quality, but in fact, something that is largely pushed back against. And I just want to take another moment on this point, because I think it's an important one when it comes to, in particular, Riesling and other varieties that where many of the great expressions have some degree of sweetness to it. And I think it's important to think about, the how at a different time and place, and up until very recently, why that sweetness was prized. And a lot of it has to do with, Germany is not a country we typically associate with wine, with the exception possibly of Riesling. I mean, most people think of it as a beer country, and it really is. Beer production massively outpaces wine production, and always has. And with grape growing, it's so marginal that really the only places in Germany for most of its history that you could even grow grapes were in these very specific river valleys, where you had the moderating influence of the river to keep the vines from freezing too badly during the winter, and to keep the weather, a little warmer during the end of the growing season, and where the vineyards faced essentially due south or something, like with a lot of southern aspect, so that you would get as much sun as you could and as much ripeness as possible. And so the finest vineyards were the ones that could really get wines, to a degree of ripeness that in most of the rest of the world would still be barely, even ripe, let alone the more marginal vineyards that really couldn't, in all but the best vintages, couldn't produce wine at all. And so that's where a lot of the German orientation around wine comes from, is this idea that wine is a marginal product, that it can only be made in these very specific places, and is hard to make. And so if you are able to get your grapes to a degree of ripeness that allowed you to make some of the really sweeter, more reserve style dessert wines that you see in some cases in Germany, that was the greatest accomplishment. And we don't tend to think about things that way so much anymore. And even the Germans themselves have really transformed their thinking about wine, but it's still very prevalent in the German and Austrian, which obviously has a lot of similarities in that sort of mindset around wine and the way the wines are categorized and organized. A little bit more about Riesling before we get into tasting. The first thing I would say about it is that and it makes sense because it's so associated with cooler growing places. It's a grape with a relatively short growing season, so it buds late and ripens early, and that short growing season is why you're able to grow it in places like Germany and other really cool regions like the Finger Lakes in New York, parts of Austria, etc. It's also quite cold resistant, meaning that the vines themselves are hardy even in relatively cold winter temperatures, and that's something that is again really prized when it comes to these marginal regions that Riesling is very often found in. So the last thing I'd say is, so obviously I've talked about Germany a bunch. I mentioned Austria. You also find really great Riesling in Alsace in France, which is just across the border from Germany, and at various points in history has been part of Germany. So the tradition with Riesling there makes a lot of sense. There's also some great Riesling in the United States, here in the state of Washington, in the Finger Lakes in upstate New York, as I mentioned, in Oregon as well. And then lastly, I think you can find some really great expressions of Riesling in Australia, though there's also Riesling planted in lots of other countries, some of which are also quite good, but just not necessarily all that easy to find for most of us, especially here in the US. So let's get to the wine here. So as I mentioned before, and for those of you who joined in a little bit later, I have the 2014 J.J. Prum Veltliner Sonnenner Cabernet Riesling. So Veltliner Sonnenner, and we'll talk about this in a minute, is a specific vineyard where this wine comes from within the broader Mosel Valley. And Cabernet is a reference to, I'll get into the scale a little bit, but basically it isn't exactly a measure of sweetness. It's a measure of ripeness when the grapes are picked more than anything else, which roughly translates to sweetness. As you move up the scale, the wines tend to get sweeter, but it's not ironclad. It's a little more complicated, like most things with wine and with Germany in particular. So as far as these wines, and if you're drinking a Cabernet from the Mosel somewhere, you should be getting a lot of these notes. So on the nose, a lot of the fruit profile that we'll expect to get here will be tart green fruits. So green apple, lime, you might get some grapefruit. You also might get from some of these wines a little bit of a hint of peach. Riesling as a variety can definitely take on more of a peachy aroma as it gets riper. So in some cases, like with Alsatian Riesling or Riesling from Washington, say, peach can be a really dominant character. In wines from the Mosel, I don't find it all that often, with some exceptions. And actually, there is a little bit of it on this wine, which, when I explain the vineyard itself, will make a little more sense. Also, a lot of floral notes, in particular things like jasmine and sort of these white, not super perfumey. It doesn't have the aroma of something like Gewürztraminer, which those of you who've tried and smelled before will sort of get the comparison, where that wine is almost flamboyantly floral. Riesling definitely, though, has a floral character, especially these wines from the Mosel. And then the last thing I would say is, you can certainly expect to, especially with a little bit of age, to get a hint of it's essentially a chemically smell. Some people would call it gasoline. The term that gets thrown around in wine circles is petrol, because apparently the Brits invented wine tasting, even though none of us would ever use the word petrol anywhere else. It's a little plasticky, could be another way to describe it. And I'm not going to get into the chemistry behind that, in part because it's complicated, in part because I'm not 100% on it myself. But essentially, it's the results of this chemical compound that forms in the grapes as they're ripening, with more exposure to sunlight. And as the wine ages, that chemical compound becomes more pronounced, especially as an aroma. It's not really something that I tend to taste, but it is something that you smell. And if you have older Riesling, whether from Germany or other places, you can often get a pretty strong sense of that sort of gasoline kind of smell. On the palate, this is where the wines can really distinguish themselves. So in some cases, with certain expressions of Riesling, you'll stick with that really kind of tart green fruit profile, lime, green apple skin, that kind of thing. With this wine here, the palate is much more of that sort of peachy, maybe even a little bit of really kind of ripe lime, key lime maybe. And that makes sense for this wine because of, again, like I said, the vineyard it's from. And I promise I will get to that in a minute. There's also a lot of acidity on these wines. And what I love about these wines is that when they're really well made, and this wine certainly is, you get this beautiful balance of the sweetness, because there is some residual sugar in this wine, and the acidity, and you don't even almost notice the acidity until you're, say, trying to talk about the wine on a live stream and you are salivating almost out of control. And I apologize, but that's really what's happening here. And that's just the acid in the wine, and it produces that sort of bodily response, and it's a hallmark of the variety of Riesling and of this region in particular. And it's really cool. One of the things I love about these wines from the Mosel is, you don't often find wine these days anywhere that is. This is so, I'll put it up to the label. This is labeled at 8% alcohol, which is 3-4% lower than almost anything else you'll find typically outside of Riesling, and really Riesling from the Mosel. And it's not like crazy sweet. Sometimes you can find other wines at similar levels of alcohol that are very sweet because very little of the sugar has been fermented, or a lot of it hasn't. And this is really nicely balanced wine. And at 8%, quite honestly, you can drink this bottle of wine and probably not regret it in the way that you might with a lot of other wines, depending on your own drinking habits. And that's something that I really love about it. It also means that the low alcohol means that the wine is really a little more approachable with a lot of different food. And we'll get to pairing as we kind of wrap things up. I don't want to jump too far ahead. But it does mean that some flavor and sort of taste components that can be a little bit clashy with higher alcohol wines can work really well with these Rieslings. So let's talk a little more about what the label here says, because I want to kind of dive into this. So first of all, we're in Germany, right? And unless you speak German, and German can be really intimidating, which I find really interesting because, for those who speak English, obviously German is the language that has the most sort of commonality with English, but we don't learn it, and there are a lot of differences. So let's start with just some generality of what's going on in the label here. So we're going to start at the top of the bottle with the capsule here. So this is not how I would normally remove the foil. I normally would cut lower, but I wanted to leave some of this intact. So you can see, hopefully, that at the very top here, there's this gold band, and there's a sort of very traditionally German-styled eagle up there. Again, I'll try and get as good a view as I can. And that, plus down below, this other gold band that says VDP, means that this winery, JJ Prum, is a member in the Verbänddeutscher Prädikatsweingüter. That was, I think, reasonably good German. And that is not an official governmental organization, as is often the case with most other European wine countries, wine producing countries. It's actually an association of producers that's voluntary, but it's extremely influential, and many of the best producers in the country are a member of it. And what that means is essentially that there are certain additional rules that these wineries adhere to, and they also kind of are connected to this series of great vineyards, right? Sort of the equivalent in German of what the French would consider Premier and Grand Cru vineyards, say in Burgundy. And this vineyard, Vellener Sonnenner, is one of those. So quick German lesson, usually the ending ER on a word is possessive. So Wehlen, Wehlen, is a town in the Mosel, and Vellener means of Wehlen, and Sonnenner is sundial. And so there are 3 different of these vineyards throughout the Mosel Valley that are all the Sonnenner vineyards, and they literally have big sundials in them. And the reason that they are prized vineyards, all 3 of them, is because practically the sundials were placed in the parts of the valley that were most likely to get as much sun as possible, because a sundial doesn't do you any damn good if the sun isn't shining on it. So, and because in the characteristic of all these vineyards and where they're placed in Germany and in the Mosel Valley in particular is trying to maximize the amount of sun you can get. So another hallmark of the vineyards in the Mosel in particular is they are extremely steep. I was there a year and a half ago, and it's remarkable. You can see it in pictures, you can read about it, and until you are there, it is almost impossible to fathom how anyone works in these vineyards. I mean, some of J.J. Prim's vineyards have a nearly 80-degree slope. I mean, that's essentially a cliff face. And they're growing vines on here. Everything is done by hand, by people, because you can't possibly get any kind of machinery that would work on a slope that steep. And it's actually kind of dangerous. Like, people do occasionally fall to their death doing this. Fortunately, not very much anymore. They've done a lot to ensure, put more safety precautions in. But it's really pretty remarkable that anyone farms this. And it goes to show you how kind of desperate these people in Germany were to have wine, and that they were willing to kind of grow it in these areas. So the last thing we'll talk about on this, besides the obvious, which is 2014, is the vintage. That's pretty straightforward. Is this term cabinet. So I mentioned earlier that cabinet refers to a degree not so much of sweetness in the wine, but the ripeness of the grapes at harvest time. And so there is a system throughout all of Germany that most wines adhere to. There are wines that do not fall into this, that are generally less expensive wines that may be just labeled a wine of a broader region, not of a specific place like this wine. But basically, the scale goes from cabinet to Spätlese, Auslese, Beerenauslese, and Trockenbeerenauslese. And the further up that you go, the riper essentially the grapes were at harvest. It's also complicated because, especially with Beerenauslese and Trockenbeerenauslese, you're dealing with the influence of something called botrytis, which I'll come to in a moment. But there you're dealing with not just ripeness, but also a sort of dehydration of the grapes through this sort of enzymatic process that this rot affects the grapes. Also, my dog is snoring in the background, so I am apparently boring him. I apologize. Couple of things to note about the Mosel before we move on to a little bit more about this wine in particular. I mentioned it's the extremely steep slopes. It's also this really fascinating kind of extremely meandering river. It'll have these almost kind of 360-degree turns as you progress down it, which does mean that you have these really sort of strikingly beautiful vistas. It's perhaps the most beautiful wine region I've ever been to, and I've been to a fair number of quite pretty ones. It also is sort of fairy tale-esque, that sort of we associate a lot of here, at least in the US. I think a lot of the sort of classic fairy tale architecture is sort of German architecture, and it's very cool to see that in person as well. But I mentioned, so extremely steep sloped. The other thing that's really interesting about this region, and I don't go into geology a lot because it's not for everyone, and that's totally fair. But the other thing that sort of facilitates winemaking in this region is that the principal soil type, sort of surface level, is blue slate, and it's very good at absorbing, retaining, and then radiating heat during the last part of the day and into the evening, and that helps sort of promote ripening again in this sort of very marginal area. Although I will say that in visiting the region in 2018 and talking to some winemakers there, it is less marginal now than it used to be. Global warming is a real thing for them, and as a result, they're actually getting more ripeness than they used to, and frankly, a little more than they maybe want. And some of them, a lot of the old ideas and old sort of concepts about how to make wine in the Mosel are being really put under some real stress by this change in the growing conditions. And so for some, that means that these traditional, really highly regarded vineyards may actually get a little more ripe than they really truly want to make the best wine they can. And it may mean that, well, this will be very difficult to do and is obviously very controversial. It may mean that some of the best vineyards in the future may not be what are considered the historic best vineyards, because a lot of that, and as was the case with France, a lot of that classification happened in the 1800s, in the early 1900s, and just in totally different growing conditions and with less understanding of how to grow and make wine than we have now. And so some of the places that were maybe thought to be too cold for growing grapes or not optimal may actually turn out to be a little bit more of a happy medium now as the climate warms and as the understanding and know-how grow as well. So let's talk a little bit about the winery before we dive into some pairings. So J.J. Prum was founded in the early 1900s. The Prum family, which is a larger extended family in the Mosel, has a few different offshoots. So you can find some often two initials like S.A. Prum that are from the region as well. This vineyard, Velen Sonnenner, and Velen is the sort of center is where the winery is based. But they do have some holdings in a few other towns. And again, as you go down the river, these towns are kind of right after each other, and they're very small. I mean, Bernkastel, which is sort of the biggest, Peaceport are kind of the two biggest. I mean, they're towns. I mean, they're not cities. They're maybe a couple thousand people live there. They're very small and beautiful and very sort of tourist oriented, but they're not necessarily their names on a map, or on a bottle, but they're not big communes. And because of how steep the valley slopes are, it's also really interesting. There's not like a lot else nearby. You're kind of near the Black Forest. If you traverse from France into Germany to sort of go into the valley, you kind of drive right through the Black Forest, as I did, which is cool. Also very you get why that's where like Hansel and Gretel is set. It's like the forest is like very, very thick and kind of scary, even in the middle of the day. It's not, these are very small towns and there's not a big community there. There aren't suburbs, they're just these sort of hamlets as you go down the river. Some are bigger, some are a little smaller. But it's really it is very quaint in that sense. So as I mentioned, J.J. Prum was founded a little over 100 years ago. Katharina Prum is the current winemaker. She is the fourth generation of the family to be a winemaker. And these wines, and I can definitely vouch for this, her wines in particular, I think, since she's taken over the head of the winemaking, are really designed to be enjoyed with some age. They are not meant to be enjoyed all that young. This, as I said, is a 2014, and this is kind of the earliest, maybe a year ago, 2 years ago max, is when I would start thinking about drinking these. I with her wines in particular, I like to wait 5-10 years before even touching them. So this is in a really nice place now. I think it will continue to develop over time, but I wouldn't rush out to drink these. Some Riesling is definitely best really young and fresh, but great Riesling from the Mosel should definitely be enjoyed with at least a little bit of age, because it gives that acidity a little bit of time to soften and the wine to kind of come together a little bit. So I am going to dive into a few thoughts about pairing before we wrap it up. But of course, if you guys have any questions or thoughts, feel free to throw a comment up there. So pairing. So we're going to get one thing out of the way right now, which is one of the laziest pairing ideas that people come up with when they talk about Riesling is like, oh, Riesling goes well with Asian food, which is, for one, like the dumbest trope ever. Because if you think about the incredible diversity that the term Asian food sort of lumps together, it's insane. I wouldn't necessarily drink this wine with, I don't know, sushi. I wouldn't also necessarily drink this wine with pad thai. There's a lot of things where that cliche is just, it really is just a lazy cliche. That isn't to say that there aren't specific kinds of cuisine from East and Southeast Asia that this can work really well with. One of the things, as I was mentioning earlier about this wine as a lower alcohol wine, is that it works better with spicier foods, especially if there's a little bit of sweetness. And that's in part because alcohol kind of heightens our impression of of spice. It's the reason why with a lot of sort of spicy cuisine, be that Central and South American or Southeast or East Asian, often what a lot of people drink is beer, and especially kind of lighter beers, because again, low alcohol, more refreshing than it is boozy, is going to be a nice kind of pairing. And same thing with these Rieslings. The sweetness also helps kind of offset the spice, so that can be really good pairing for sure. I don't mean to say that like you shouldn't do Riesling and German Riesling and certain spicy East and Southeast Asian cuisines, but you want to think a little more about it than just what like broad continent the food comes from. I also really like these wines, and this is what I'm going to be having tonight. I like these kinds of wines with really kind of salty, briny foods. So I'm making pasta tonight with some like olives and artichoke hearts and things like that. And I find that whereas like I love that sort of sweet, tart, salty, briny thing. I think it works really well together. It's kind of a classic food, just like within a dish kind of combination of flavors that I find really enjoyable. I also think that the thing about wines like this that is unusual for wines with high acidity for me is it's also pretty enjoyable just on its own. And there's not a lot of European white wine that I think of as sort of just like a sipper, but Mosel Riesling in particular, and because it has that sugar to it, that some residual sugar in it, it does tend to sort of, I think, work better as just a wine to enjoy on its own. Like I said, it's a very nice late afternoon, early evening here in Seattle. And quite honestly, maybe as soon as I finish this live stream, I might be heading out to the porch to drink a little bit more of this and enjoy that last bit of sun. And so I think that can be a really nice pairing as well, is just kind of enjoying it as it is. Because these are also really interesting, complex wines with a lot of flavor and depth to them and a lot to think about. And so sometimes just enjoying them on their own can be a better way to kind of think about and taste everything that's going on than doing so with food. But they certainly can be quite versatile with food as well. Anyhow, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you all for joining me. We're going to be back on Saturday talking about Chablis. And so another great European white, one that probably does need food a little more than this Riesling. But again, thank you. Please tune in on Saturday at 5:30 p.m. Pacific, or whatever time it is, wherever you are. And I hope you have a great rest of your Wednesday, and I will see you soon. Thanks.